the only hacker who infiltrated North Korea's secret cyber army. Before you continue, a word from us. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, you haven't even reached the most extraordinary part yet. Stories like this one, hidden, real, documented, and almost entirely ignored by mainstream media, are exactly what this channel is built to uncover. Subscribe to the channel right now and activate the notification bell so you never miss a new investigation. Every week, we bring you the stories that governments don't want told, the people history overlooked, and the events that change the world in silence. Your subscription is what makes this journalism possible. Subscribe, share, stay informed. Chapter 1. The night the internet went dark. On the night of January 9th, 2022, something extraordinary happened in one of the most isolated corners of the digital world. North Korea's internet, a fragile, tightly controlled network comprising only a few dozen publicly visible websites and a handful of government-operated servers, went completely dark. Government portals blinked offline. State airline reservation systems vanished from the web. Email infrastructure stopped responding. The official news portal of the Hermit Kingdom, the state tourism website, the propaganda broadcasting service, all of them gone, as if someone had simply reached into the backbone of the country's digital presence and unplugged it. International
We've got a breach on the
cyber
West server.
analysts
Reroute the data
scrambled
now.
to
I'm losing the
understand
connection.
What was happening?
The red team is
Some
escalating.
suspected
Block
it
port
was a
8080.
coordinated response by Western intelligence agencies to North Korea's recent flurry of ballistic missile tests. Others theorized it could be a catastrophic
If we follow
internal
this string,
failure.
it leads to the server room
The
breach.
major intelligence services issued no
And the
public
timeline doesn't
statements.
match the access logs.
The North Korean government, predictably, said nothing at all. And yet the outages continued, intermittent, sustained, and methodical, for more than a week. What almost no one knew at the time was that the person responsible for this unprecedented disruption was not a nation-state actor with billions of dollars in resources, not a sophisticated intelligence network with hundreds of operatives, and not a coordinated team of elite government hackers working from a secure facility. The person responsible was a single individual, a cybersecurity researcher operating alone from a coastal home in the state of Florida, wearing pajama pants, munching on corn chips, and watching science fiction films between rounds of launching his attack scripts. His name, at that point, was known only by the online handle P4X, pronounced Pax, a deliberate and sardonic reference to peace. He was, in his own words, simply trying to send a message. And the message, delivered with a precision and audacity that stunned the cybersecurity community when it was eventually revealed, was this.
From a
If you
nexus
come
in
after
Florida,
us,
the red
there are
lines penetrate
consequences.
deep into North
The
Korean
story
networks,
of how a
illustrating
lone
the
American
attack's
security
global
researcher
scope.
came to wage his own personal cyber war against one of the world's most secretive and dangerous state-sponsored hacking organizations is not just a tale of technical brilliance and individual bravado. It is a window into one of the most consequential and underreported conflicts of our era, the shadow war being waged every day in the invisible corridors of the internet, where a rogue
The data
nuclear
suggests
state
a
has built a
significant
digital
risk.
army
Are these
capable of
numbers
striking
confirmed
at the
by the task
financial
force?
foundations of the global economy.
We are still verifying the
and where the
sources.
responses of Western governments have often been paralyzed by bureaucracy, caution, and the sheer difficulty of fighting back in a domain where the rules of warfare are still being written. I want them to understand that if you come at us, means some of your infrastructure is going down for a while. P4X, cybersecurity researcher, speaking to Wired Magazine, 2022, Chapter 2, The Birth of a Digital Army. To understand how a single American hacker ended up in a confrontation with North Korea's secret cyber division, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to the deliberate, patient, and deeply strategic process by which one of the world's poorest and most isolated nations built itself into a genuine global cyber threat. North Korea's interest in electronic warfare dates to the early 1980s, when the regime began to recognize the strategic potential of information technology. But a serious institutional commitment to building offensive cyber capabilities came in the mid-1990s, when the country's supreme leader issued directives for the Korean People's Army to pursue what was then a radical idea: that a poor country with outdated conventional military hardware could nonetheless achieve military parity with far wealthier adversaries by mastering the digital domain. The reasoning was coldly logical. Cyber attacks are cheap to execute. They are difficult to attribute. They can be launched from anywhere in the world, and their effects can be devastating. In 1998, the infrastructure that would eventually become the world's most feared state-sponsored hacking organization was formally established under the auspices of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, the primary intelligence agency of the North Korean military. This unit, which would become known to the outside world as Bureau 121, was given a mandate that was as ambitious as it was dangerous: conduct offensive cyber operations against the nation's perceived enemies, gather intelligence through digital infiltration, and, crucially, generate hard currency for a regime increasingly strangled by international sanctions. The genius of the system, if one can apply such a word to an institution built on coercion and authoritarian control, lay in its recruitment and training pipeline. North Korea, despite its catastrophic poverty, possessed a class of technically gifted young people who had been identified through the national education system and groomed for precisely this kind of work. The process began in childhood. The regime's talent scouts moved through schools and universities, identifying students with exceptional aptitude for mathematics, computer science, and logical reasoning. Those who made the cut were offered something extraordinarily rare in North Korea: privilege. Selected students were sent to elite institutions, most notably the University of Automation in the capital and the Kim Chek University of Technology. These were not ordinary universities by North Korean standards. Students received better food rations than the general population, a significant benefit in a country where food insecurity was a chronic reality for millions of citizens.
This diagram clearly illustrates the vulnerabilities in the southern sector. We must reinforce the firewall protocols here immediately.
Foreign films, global news, uncensored internet access within carefully monitored parameters. They lived in better conditions.
Get down, they're coming back.
Higher salaries,
we have to move now if we want to make it out of here alive.
Perhaps most importantly, their families were rewarded with social privileges that represented an enormous improvement in quality of life by the standards of a country where the vast majority lived in grinding poverty.
How does the urbanization rate compare to Tokyo?
The curriculum was extraordinarily rigorous.
It says here that nearly 80% of the population lives in urban areas.
Leaving my family behind was the hardest choice. Network architecture,
every day I wonder if
they are
safe,
languages,
if they are still alive in the north,
and behavioral patterns of their target countries. Those assigned to operations against English-speaking nations spent years immersing themselves in Western culture. Those targeting South Korea studied its slang, its media landscape, its corporate culture. The goal was to produce operatives who could interact with targets, impersonate colleagues, and construct entirely convincing false identities without ever betraying their origins. One North Korean defector who attended the University of Automation and later spoke to journalists described how his cohort was divided from the first day of their education into specialized groups focused on different target countries. Each group spent approximately 2 years simply studying its assigned nation before any actual hacking training began. In North Korea, it's called the Secret War. The battle has already begun without a shot being fired. North Korean defector and former cyber student speaking to Reuters. The training extended beyond the borders of North Korea itself. Because the country's own internet access was so severely limited, virtually all traffic was routed through a single Chinese telecommunications provider in the northeastern city of Shenyang. Promising young hackers were sent abroad, primarily to China, to learn how the open internet actually worked. The northeastern Chinese city of Shenyang, located near the North Korean border, served for years as a critical operational hub. North Korean operatives lived and worked there under commercial cover, embedded in a large Korean diaspora community that provided natural camouflage for their activities. A North Korean state-owned hotel in the city, whose staff wore traditional North Korean clothing and performed folk songs for customers, served as a known gathering point for this community. Security analysts and former intelligence officials who studied the network described North Korean hackers moving from location to location within the city to conceal their activities, operating from apartments and offices that appeared entirely legitimate to casual observation. A North Korean defector who had previously worked as a computer science professor in the capital and later escaped to South Korea described this arrangement with remarkable
We knew the
detail
risks when we started the
in a series
research,
of interviews
but
with
the ethical
international
lines,
media.
they blurred quickly.
He explained
We didn't
that
anticipate the
some of his own
consequences for the
students had been
subjects.
recruited into the
저는 이
bureau,
자리에서
one-to-one
북한의
network,
잔혹한 비밀을
and were deployed
폭로해야만
abroad,
합니다.
operating
제
undercover as
증언이
employees
변화를
of North
가져오기를
Korean trading
바랍니다.
companies. By day, they would attend to their ostensible business duties. In the evenings and at night, they would work on their real assignments, infiltrating foreign computer networks, siphoning data, and conducting the financial cybercrimes that generated the hard currency the regime needed to survive. This professor's testimony represented one of the first detailed public accounts of the internal structure and culture of North Korea's hacker organization. He described an institution in which the operatives genuinely believed they were serving their country, motivated by a combination of ideological conviction, personal ambition, and the very real privileges their position afforded them. They were not, he emphasized, reluctant conscripts. They were, within the peculiar moral universe of the North Korean state, genuine patriots, men and women who had earned their elite status through extraordinary talent, and who understood that their cyber operations were as important to national survival as any missile test or military exercise. Chapter 3. The First Shadows. 2009 to 2013.
It was the summer of
The outside
2009
world first
when the
became
public
aware
finally
of North
became
Korea's
aware of the
digital
crisis.
capabilities in the summer of 2009, when a series of coordinated distributed denial of service attacks disrupted government websites and financial institutions across both South Korea and the United States. The attacks were crude by later standards.
시스템이
Essentially,
마비됐어요. 당장
enormous
보고해야 합니다.
floods of
접근이
internet
거부되고
traffic
있어요.
directed at
무슨
target
일이죠?
servers until they could no longer function.
서버가 완전히
But
나갔어요.
their scale and coordination suggested something more sophisticated than the work of ordinary criminals or hobbyist activists.
Look at the traffic
Investigators
spike at
eventually
0400Z.
traced the
It's mirroring the
infrastructure of
Titan rain
attacks
pattern from
back
last
to the
year.
same
And it's still
reconnaissance
active.
general
We have to
bureau
shut down the
unit
access
that would
point.
become notorious as Bureau 121. Over the following 2 years, from 2010 to 2012, the group honed its capabilities through a series of increasingly sophisticated attacks against South Korean targets. Military planning documents were accessed and stolen. The National Intelligence Service's computer systems were probed and infiltrated. These early operations served a dual purpose. They gathered intelligence of genuine strategic value,
The security footage
and they
from
gave
Sector
the
3 has been
operatives
wiped.
real-world
All of it.
experience in navigating the defenses of
We need immediate
sophisticated
authorization for a full
organizations.
lockdown.
Then, in March 2011, the group launched what became known as the 10 Days of Rain, a sustained campaign of distributed denial-of-service attacks against South Korean media organizations, government websites, and critical infrastructure. The attacks were launched not from North Korea's own limited internet infrastructure, but from thousands of compromised computers located within South Korea itself, hijacked by malware and used as unwitting weapons against
The
their own
botnet
country's
activity is
systems.
spiking in the southeast sector.
The technique demonstrated a
Acknowledged.
strategic
Rerouting
sophistication
traffic
that
analysis.
surprised Western security analysts
The trajectory
who had
indicates
underestimated
successful
the regime's
re-entry.
capabilities.
They've
2
accelerated
years
the
later,
program faster
in
than we thought
March
possible.
2013, the
We have
operation
confirmed
that became
escalation
known
in
as
Sector
Dark
4.
Soul
Scramble the
announced
response
to the
teams
world
now.
that North Korea had crossed a critical threshold in its cyber warfare capabilities. On a single morning, malware simultaneously activated across the computer networks of 3 of South Korea's major television broadcasters and multiple large financial institutions. Rather than merely disrupting service or stealing data,
I can't
the
access
attack
anything.
wiped
What's wrong with the
files
system?
from tens of thousands
It's completely
of
down.
computers,
We have a major
rendering
breach.
them permanently
메인 필드
unusable.
잘라. 백업 발전기 상태
Banking
당장.
services went offline. Broadcaster systems crashed. Approximately 48,000
The breach
computers
didn't just
were
steal the
affected in a
data.
coordinated
It
assault
annihilated it.
that bore the hallmarks not
This
of
is what permanent
opportunistic
deletion
criminals,
looks like.
but of a military
The
planning
trading system is
operation.
completely frozen.
Patient,
We have a breach
precisely
in the main
targeted,
control room.
and
Cut
designed
the transmission.
for maximum psychological as well as operational impact. The Dark Soul attack was significant not only for its scale and technical sophistication, but for what it revealed about the
Wait,
strategic
look at this
thinking
packet
of
sequence.
North Korea's
It's a false
cyber
flag. They want us
commanders.
focused on the energy sector.
The targets were not chosen
Where's the real
randomly.
target then?
The broadcasters and banks
Once
that
the
were
signal
hit
goes
were
down, we
institutions
move on the
whose
banks.
disruption would create maximum public
All units are ready
visibility
for the synchronized
and
takedown.
economic anxiety, without rising
As a
to the
defector, I
level
can
of an
confirm
active
the regime
war
views cyber
that might
warfare
trigger
not just as a
kinetic
tool,
military
but as the
response.
future of conflict.
It was a demonstration of capability, a message, delivered in the form of destroyed hard drives and paralyzed bank networks, that North Korea possessed the means to inflict serious damage on its adversaries at a time and in a manner of its own choosing. More than 48,000 computers were simultaneously paralyzed in South Korea in a single morning in March 2013. The work of a hacking unit whose very existence was barely acknowledged by its own government. Chapter 4: Hollywood Burns. The Sony Pictures Attack of 2014. The attack that finally forced the world to confront the full dimensions of North Korea's cyber capabilities came not against a military target, not against a financial institution or a power grid, but against a Hollywood film studio. The target was chosen with a particular kind of outrage that spoke volumes about the priorities and sensitivities of the regime directing the operation. In 2014,
in the third
Sony
sector.
Pictures Entertainment was preparing to
assets
release
in
a
position?
comedy film in which 2 bumbling journalists were recruited by the CIA to assassinate the North Korean leader. The film was broad slapstick entertainment, the sort of politically edgy comedy that American studios occasionally produced with little thought for its diplomatic consequences. In Pyongyang, however, the film was treated as something close to an act of war. A direct attack on the dignity and authority of the supreme leader, which, by the logic of the North Korean state, represented an assault on the nation itself. The response was decided at the highest levels of the regime's security apparatus. What followed was one of the most devastating corporate cyber attacks in history, executed with a methodical patience that revealed just how seriously North Korea took the operation. The attack did not begin in November 2014, when it burst into public view. It had actually begun more than a year earlier, when operatives from the Bureau 121 network gained initial access to Sony's computer systems through a carefully crafted spear phishing campaign. Targeted emails designed to trick the specific employees into downloading malware that would give the attackers a foothold inside the network. For months, the operatives moved through Sony systems undetected, patiently mapping the company's infrastructure, identifying the location of sensitive files, and systematically exfiltrating enormous quantities of data. They stole unreleased films. They copied entire email archives of senior executives. They gathered personnel records containing the private information of thousands of employees. They
Line is
accessed salary
completely
data,
dead. Look at
scripts
this
for
error
films in
message. We can't do
development,
anything.
corporate strategy documents, and private correspondence that exposed embarrassing information about relationships between studio executives and major Hollywood figures. The destructive phase of the attack began on November 24, 2014, when a message appeared on Sony employees' computer screens from a group calling itself the Guardians of Peace. What followed was the activation of wiper malware that had been quietly installed on thousands of Sony computers during the months of preparation. The malware systematically destroyed data on machine after machine, rendering entire departments unable to function. Up to 70% of Sony's computers were damaged or destroyed in the attack. The company was forced to return to using pen and paper for basic operations. Email systems were down, phones were compromised. The studio was effectively paralyzed. The stolen data was then released incrementally over the following weeks, with each release calculated to cause maximum embarrassment and disruption. Unreleased films appeared on file-sharing sites. Executive emails containing candid assessments of actors, directors, and studio politics were published.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation is taking over this case due to national security implications.
The private financial details of celebrities became public knowledge. And accompanying the data releases were threats directed at theaters that planned to show the comedy film at the center of the controversy, all with language that invoked the memory of major terrorist attacks and promised consequences for audiences who attended. The FBI formally attributed the attack to North Korea in December 2014, marking one of the first times a major Western government had publicly attributed a significant cyber attack to a specific nation-state.
We demand the release!
It was a landmark
we demand
moment.
The release!
Sony
Support
Pictures
the
incurred
artists.
costs estimated at somewhere between $35 million
The
and
Reckoning.
$85 million
Finally.
in the immediate
Yeah,
aftermath
I
of
heard
the
it was
attack,
incredible.
not counting the long-term
We have to see it
reputational
tonight.
damage. The studio ultimately canceled the theatrical release of the film before reversing that decision after intense public and political pressure. The message from Pyongyang had been received, and then, in the most American fashion possible, defiantly rejected. But beyond the spectacle of Hollywood executives humiliated and a major studio brought to its knees, the Sony attack revealed something of profound strategic importance. North Korea had demonstrated the capability to inflict serious economic damage on major Western institutions from the other side of the world, without a single soldier crossing a border or a single missile being launched. The era of cyber war as a genuine geopolitical instrument had arrived. Chapter 5: The Bangladesh Bank Heist, 2016. If the Sony attack demonstrated North Korea's capacity for destruction, the operation that followed demonstrated something arguably more alarming: its capacity for theft on a scale that defied comprehension. The Bangladesh bank heist of 2016 was, and remains, one of the most audacious financial crimes in history. A meticulously planned operation that came within a typographical error of stealing nearly $1 billion from a developing nation's central bank reserves. The groundwork for the heist was laid in January 2015, when employees at the Bangladesh bank received what appeared to be a routine job application email from an individual seeking employment at the institution. The email contained a link to download the applicant's resume and cover letter. At least one employee clicked the link. The file they downloaded contained malware. In that single moment of inattention, the hackers had their foothold. What followed was a masterclass in patience, precision, and operational discipline. For months, the operatives studied the bank's internal systems with meticulous care. They learned how the institution processed international transactions. They mapped the relationships between the bank's internal network and the SWIFT messaging system, the global financial communications infrastructure that banks use to send verified payment instructions to each other. They identified the specific procedures, the specific authentication methods, the specific schedules that governed how the bank managed its account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where Bangladesh maintained approximately $1 billion in foreign currency reserves. The hackers even managed to sabotage the printer that the bank used to produce paper records of SWIFT transactions, ensuring that the fraudulent transfers would not be immediately noticed by staff checking
Confirming the
physical
data feed now.
printouts.
Get me risk management on
It
the
was a
secure
detail
line.
that spoke to the thoroughness of their preparation and the intelligence they had gathered about the bank's internal processes. In February 2016, the operatives were ready. They used their access to the SWIFT system to submit 35 fraudulent transfer requests, directing the Federal Reserve to move funds from Bangladesh Bank's New York account to accounts in the Philippines. The total value of the requested transfers was approximately $951 million, nearly the entire balance of the account. Most of the transfers were blocked by the Federal Reserve when analysts noticed suspicious patterns in the requests.
Did you see the notification?
But
Yes,
5
all accounts are
transactions
showing the same
totaling
discrepancy.
$101
We have a
million
problem.
went through before the alarms were raised. Of those $101 million, $20 million was recovered when a bank in Sri Lanka noticed a spelling error in one of the transfer documents and reversed the transaction. The remaining $81 million arrived in accounts at a bank in the Philippines and was almost immediately withdrawn and converted into casino chips, making it effectively untraceable through conventional financial investigation. The money was laundered through the Philippine casino industry in a matter of days. A single misspelled word, foundation instead of foundation, triggered an alert that prevented North Korea from stealing nearly $1 billion in a single operation. Even so, $81 million vanished without trace. The Bangladesh bank heist represented a qualitative transformation in the threat posed by North Korea's cyber capabilities. This was not espionage. This was not sabotage. This was state-sponsored bank robbery at a scale that no criminal organization had ever attempted. Directed not at a private institution, but at the national treasury of a sovereign nation. And it had almost worked perfectly. The implications for global financial security were staggering. Investigators and cybersecurity researchers who examined the evidence of the attack subsequently found technical connections between the malware used in the Bangladesh heist and the code deployed in the Sony attack 2 years earlier. The same patterns, the same programming signatures, the same operational fingerprints. The same unit that had humiliated Hollywood had just stolen a fortune from a central bank, and Western governments still had no effective response. Chapter 6, WannaCry and the Global Infection, 2017. On May 12, 2017, a ransomware
your
program
important files
began
are
spreading through
encrypted.
computer networks around
It is
the world,
too late to
with a
decrypt the
speed
files
and
without
breadth that had
paying.
never been seen before in the history of cyber warfare. Within hours, the malware, which researchers would name WannaCry, had infected hundreds of thousands of computers in more than 150 countries. Hospitals in Britain found their patient record systems locked, forcing the cancellation of medical appointments and surgical procedures. Telecommunications companies
Do you
in
think we'll be
Spain
back
went
next week?
offline.
I don't know.
Factories operated
They haven't
by
told us
major
anything.
Industrial corporations stopped production. Universities, government agencies, logistics companies, and small businesses across Europe, Asia, and North America found themselves staring at screens that displayed nothing but a ransom demand and a countdown clock. WannaCry exploited a critical vulnerability in the Windows operating system, a flaw that had actually been discovered and weaponized by the United States National Security Agency as part of its own offensive cyber arsenal. The NSA's exploit, codenamed Eternal Blue, had been stolen from the agency by a mysterious group calling itself the Shadow Brokers, which had then published it publicly on the internet in April 2017. Microsoft had issued a security patch 2 months before the WannaCry attack, but the vast majority of vulnerable systems had not yet installed the update, leaving them exposed to an exploit that was now freely available to anyone with the knowledge to use it. The North Korean operatives who deployed WannaCry took the stolen NSA weapon, combined it with their own ransomware payload, and released it into the wild as a global weapon. The effect was catastrophic. Britain's National Health Service was among the hardest hit, with hospitals and clinics across the country
Sorry, mate, we're currently
unable
full.
to
You need to head to
access
the Royal
patient
London.
records,
Understood.
forcing the diversion of ambulances and the cancellation of approximately 19,000
I can't get this to work at all. It
medical
just says system
appointments.
locked.
The total economic damage
We have
from
critical
WannaCry has
patients
been
waiting.
estimated at
This is
over
a disaster.
$4 billion globally. What made WannaCry particularly unusual among ransomware attacks was its apparent lack of a coherent financial motive. The ransom demands were relatively modest, and the mechanism for collecting payments was poorly designed, suggesting that financial gain was not the primary objective. Security analysts concluded that the attack may have been designed primarily to cause disruption and chaos, or that it was a test of the weapon's capabilities that spiraled out of control.
Look at this mutex.
Whatever the intent,
it's the same signature as the samples from the NHS attack.
And
Yeah,
the attribution
the
to
encryption
North
routine
Korea
hasn't
was
changed at
eventually
all.
confirmed by the United States Department of Justice, the British government,
the nation's highest
and a
law
coalition
enforcement
of Western
agency,
security
now
agencies.
facing its greatest challenge.
The WannaCry attack marked a
The
significant
situation in the
escalation
eastern
in the
province
international
demands an
perception of
immediate
North
and
Korea's
unified
cyber
response
threat.
from this coalition.
A regime that had previously been understood as a regional nuisance.
This high-contrast
A poor,
visualization.
isolated dictatorship whose nuclear saber-rattling was managed through diplomatic isolation was now revealed as an actor capable of causing catastrophic economic damage to some of the world's most sophisticated nations. The NHS, the largest healthcare system in the world, had been crippled by malware originating from a country that most Western citizens associated primarily with Cold War-era anachronism.
This wasn't part of the
and
contingency
nuclear
plan. The worm is
brinkmanship.
adapting.
I
The
understand,
cybersecurity
but we have to
community
push the
struggled to
update now,
calibrate its
or we lose the
response to
grid.
a threat that seemed to grow more dangerous with each passing year. Chapter 7: The Professor and the Shadows. Inside the recruitment machine. To understand how North Korea built this capability, it is necessary to understand the human infrastructure that sustained it, the generations of talented young people who were identified, trained, and deployed as the regime's most valuable weapons. And for that understanding, there is no better guide than the testimony of those who lived inside the system and eventually found the courage to leave it. A North Korean computer science professor who had taught at one of the country's most prestigious technical institutions before escaping to South Korea in 2004 gave a series of
In our
remarkably
field,
detailed
precision is
interviews
not
to
merely a
international
goal.
journalists
It is
in
an
the years
absolute
following his
requirement for the
defection.
stability of the
He
state.
described a recruitment
Look at this
pipeline
anomaly
that
right
was
here.
both sophisticated and
That's a
utterly
backdoor.
ruthless
Trace the
in its
origin now.
logic. The most talented students were identified early and tracked through the educational system. Those who demonstrated the right combination of technical aptitude, political reliability, and psychological suitability were offered opportunities that existed nowhere else in North Korean society. The professor described watching some of his most gifted students disappear into what he knew was the Bureau 121 network, deploying abroad under commercial cover while conducting cyber operations for the state.
If we leverage the
By
futures
day,
contracts
he
now,
said,
we minimize
they
the
worked at
exposure before the
ostensibly
announcement.
legitimate
That
jobs.
aligns with the projected growth.
Employees
Let's
of
move forward
North
with that
Korean
strategy.
trading companies, representatives of state-owned enterprises conducting business in Chinese cities. But in the evenings and
We
throughout
lived
the
in a
night,
world built
they
on
were
lies.
conducting
The
operations
psychological
on behalf
impact
of
of realizing this
Reconnaissance
truth,
General
it stays
Bureau,
with you forever.
carrying out the
It is a
cyber
heavy burden.
campaigns that generated both intelligence and hard currency for the regime. He described the psychological situation of these young operatives with a complexity that defied easy categorization. They were not coerced in the conventional sense. They had genuinely competed for and won coveted positions in a system that rewarded technical excellence with extraordinary privilege by North Korean standards. They had access to the outside world, its culture, its technology, its information, in a way that was simply unimaginable for ordinary citizens. And they had internalized, through years of ideological education, a
Built in the
worldview
brutalist
in which
Soviet
their cyber
style,
operations
this
were
monolithic
acts of
structure
patriotic
looms over the
service against
capital,
adversarial
shrouded in
nations
perpetual
that were
fog.
genuinely
The
threatening
Revolutionary
to their
Armed
country's
Forces,
survival.
under the guidance
But
of the great
professor also
leader,
described
are
the
marching
shadow side
forward
of
to
this
victory.
arrangement. The families of operatives deployed abroad were, according to his testimony, held as a form of collateral. If an operative defected or failed to perform adequately, the consequences for family members remaining in North Korea could be severe. This system of hostage diplomacy, widely documented by human rights organizations, ensured the loyalty of even the most capable and independently minded operatives. The threat was never spoken aloud, it was simply understood. An ever-present background condition that shaped every decision these young men and women made in their years working abroad. A separate defector who had himself attended North Korea's elite military computer science program and served in the broader cyber warfare infrastructure before escaping to South Korea described the same dynamic from a student's
Please
perspective.
verify this entry.
He
It is
spoke of
correct.
the intense
The quarterly
competition to
figures
join
are
the
ready for
program,
submission.
the pride that came with selection, and the gradual realization that the privilege of his position came with obligations that could not be questioned. He spoke of a friend who had worked for an overseas department of the cyber warfare unit while maintaining cover as an employee of a North Korean trading company. A man who lived a completely
Sometimes I
double
wonder if
life,
the freedom was worth the
whose
cost.
colleagues and acquaintances had no idea
The
who he
memories still
actually
haunt me
was
every night.
or what he actually did. These aren't pieces of malware being shared on underground forums. These are very well-guarded code bases that haven't leaked out or been publicly available. Cybersecurity researcher on the distinctive fingerprints of North Korean malware. The defector described the emotional and psychological complexity of this existence with striking candor. The young hackers were aware, to varying degrees, that their country was impoverished and controlled in ways that the outside world they had access to was not. But this awareness did not automatically translate into opposition or defection.
As the
For
market
many,
surged, the
combination
data
of
centers
genuine
reflected a new era
patriotism,
of digital
family
finance,
obligation,
signaling explosive
personal
growth
privilege,
and unprecedented
and carefully
opportunity.
curated ideological education was sufficient to sustain their commitment. For others, the seeds of doubt planted by years of exposure to the outside world would eventually grow into the decision to risk everything and leave. Chapter 8: The Escalation, Cryptocurrency, and the New Financial Frontier. As blockchain technology and cryptocurrency markets exploded in scale and value through the late 2000s, North Korea's cyber operatives adapted
The attack vector was
with
unprecedented.
characteristic
11
speed and
different nations
sophistication.
simultaneously reaching and targeting the
Cryptocurrency
central
offered
bank in
something that
Dhaka.
traditional bank robbery through the SWIFT network did not. The possibility of near-anonymous international transfers that were extraordinarily difficult to trace and virtually impossible to freeze or reverse. The regime's financial criminals moved aggressively into this new terrain. The U.S. Treasury Department formally sanctioned 3 North Korean state-sponsored hacking groups, Lazarus, Blunerov, and Andariel, in September 2019, in an unprecedented public acknowledgement of the scale and nature of the threat. The sanctions documentation described Blunerov as a subgroup that had attempted to steal over $1.1 billion from financial institutions across 11 countries, including Bangladesh, India,
The moving
Pakistan,
averages suggest a
Taiwan,
downturn here.
Turkey, Chile, and
Let's
Vietnam,
review the support levels at
through
30,000.
attacks on the SWIFT messaging system and cryptocurrency exchanges. Andariel was described as specializing in ATM attacks and the infiltration of South Korean government and financial systems. And Lazarus, the largest of the 3, was characterized as the umbrella organization directing all of these activities, responsible for the Sony attack, the WannaCry ransomware campaign, and a growing portfolio of cryptocurrency heists. The cryptocurrency attacks followed patterns that were recognizable from the group's earlier operations: patient infiltration of target organizations, often through spear-phishing campaigns targeting specific employees, extended periods of reconnaissance during which the operatives mapped the target systems and procedures, and then a decisive strike designed to maximize the value extracted while minimizing the forensic trail. Japanese cryptocurrency exchanges were targeted and robbed of hundreds of millions of dollars. South Korean crypto trading platforms were systematically attacked.
gone!
Decentralized finance protocols were exploited through technical vulnerabilities that the North Korean hackers had identified and weaponized. A significant innovation that emerged in this period was the use of sophisticated social engineering through professional networking platforms. North Korean operatives created meticulously constructed fake identities as cybersecurity researchers, venture capitalists, talent recruiters, and industry professionals. They populated these fake identities with years of carefully curated online activity, building apparent track records that could withstand scrutiny. They used these identities to approach employees at cryptocurrency companies, financial institutions, and technology firms, offering opportunities that seemed too good to be true, and often, for their targets, turned out to be exactly that. An offer of a high-paying job, accompanied by a file to download or a link to follow, could be the first step in a chain that ended with an organization's entire cryptocurrency holdings being drained. By 2022, the UN Security Council's panel of experts estimated that North Korea had stolen between $500 million and $1 billion in cryptocurrency annually, generating a revenue stream that partially compensated for the devastating impact of international sanctions on the regime's foreign currency earnings.
The iron wall of our revolution marches on!
In late 2023,
Glory to the Workers' Party of Korea and our supreme leader!
Approximately $3 billion in cryptocurrency over a period of 6 years. These were not the uncertain estimates of people speculating about classified government programs. These were figures derived from blockchain analysis, the forensic examination of the permanent public record of all cryptocurrency transactions, which allowed investigators to trace the movement of stolen
While these men
funds
went about
through
their
dozens
daily
of wallets
banking,
and
their
exchanges,
deposits were being
watching the
diverted
money
to
being
fund
systematically
weapons.
laundered, even as they were powerless to recover most of it. The human cost of this financial predation extended far beyond the immediate victims of specific heists. The funds stolen by North Korea's cyber operatives flowed directly into the regime's most dangerous programs: its nuclear weapons development, its ballistic missile program, and the maintenance of a military apparatus that consumed a grotesquely disproportionate share.
The regime's
of a
illicit
desperately
funds
poor
flow through a
country's
complex
resources.
web of global
When North
exchanges.
Korea tested a ballistic
firewall
missile
integrity
in
is
2022,
failing, Secretary.
the launch
We have less
vehicles
than
and
5 minutes
fuel and
before they breach the
engineering
grid.
expertise required were paid for, at least in part, by money stolen from cryptocurrency investors, from bank depositors, from healthcare systems whose computers had been held
My
hostage
involvement
for
began
ransom.
subtly.
Chapter 9.
By the time I realized...
Professors in counterintelligence, exposing the network. Throughout the years of escalating North Korean cyber operations, the community of cybersecurity professionals and intelligence analysts tasked with understanding and countering the threat worked with
Every word I
increasing
say
urgency
here must be
to
weighed.
map the full dimensions of the network
My
they were
family's
confronting.
lives depend on my precision.
The defector testimonies
This building
provided
here,
crucial insight
in
into the
Shenyang.
human architecture of the operation.
This is where they
But the
held me
technical
for
work
3
of
years.
attribution, of definitively linking specific malware, specific techniques, and specific operational patterns to the Bureau 121 network required years of painstaking forensic analysis. The breakthrough insight that began to unlock the mystery of the Lazarus Group's true identity came from a peculiarity that security researchers gradually recognized in the malware the group deployed across its various operations. Unlike most sophisticated hacking groups, which were careful to avoid reusing code across operations to prevent forensic linking, the North Korean operatives displayed a recurring pattern of reusing specific elements of their malware across what initially appeared to be unrelated attacks. Fragments of code from the 2014 Sony attack appeared in the malware used in the 2016 Bangladesh bank heist. Programming patterns from the Dark Soul attack appeared in WannaCry. These were not, as the researchers
The intelligence
noted with
confirms
emphasis,
a credible threat
the
to
kinds
national
of code
security.
snippets that were
We
freely
need to
available
mobilize
on
immediately
underground hacking
and locate the
forums.
target.
They were unique, proprietary elements of a carefully guarded code base, the kind of reuse that indicated either extreme confidence that attribution would be impossible, or a systematic institutional practice that had become embedded in the operational culture of a large organization. The FBI's September 2018 indictment of a North Korean national who had worked for a front company operated by the Reconnaissance General Bureau in China represented a landmark in the public attribution of North Korean cyber operations. The indictment laid out in precise detail the connections between this individual the front company's activities, and the malware signatures from multiple major attacks. It was the first time a specific named individual had been charged in connection with the Lazarus Group's operations, and the evidence presented in the indictment. Tracing network connections, analyzing code, following financial flows, demonstrated the extraordinary forensic capabilities that intelligence agencies had brought to bear on the problem. The indictment was notable for something else as well. Its frank acknowledgement that the prospect of actually arresting and trying the individual named was essentially nil. He was in North Korea or in Chinese territory, protected by a regime that would never extradite him, and shielded by diplomatic arrangements that made law enforcement cooperation impossible. The indictment was, in practical terms, a public statement of what the government knew and a form of international pressure rather than a genuine legal proceeding. The named individual continued his work, the Bureau 121 network continued its operations, and the indictment existed primarily as a historical document, a record of what had been done and who had done it, without any realistic expectation of legal consequence. In December 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice charged 3 North Korean hackers with stealing $1.3 billion in cryptocurrency. The likelihood of any of them ever standing trial, essentially zero. This legal impunity was one of the central structural features that made North Korea's cyber operations so uniquely dangerous. Unlike criminal hacking groups operating from countries that maintained at least nominal relationships with Western law enforcement, unlike Russian cybercriminals who occasionally found themselves at risk of arrest when they traveled abroad,
what did I miss this time?
The Bureau 121 hackers operated in an environment of essentially total impunity. Their government protected them. Their country had no extradition treaties with the nations they attacked. And the geopolitical complexity of confronting a nuclear-armed state made even the most forceful diplomatic responses feel inadequate to the scale of the problem. Chapter 10. The Silent War Within the War. The IT Worker Infiltration Scheme. As North Korea's cyber capabilities grew in sophistication and ambition through the 2020s, the regime developed an additional vector of attack that was at once more brazen and more personal than anything it had attempted before. Rather than simply attacking Western companies from the outside, North Korea began systematically placing its operatives inside those companies. Not as hackers lurking in compromised networks, but as ostensible employees holding legitimate jobs, earning Western salaries, and conducting espionage and sabotage from within the organizations they had infiltrated. The scheme, which gradually came to the attention of Western security agencies through arrests, investigations, and eventually the testimony of defectors.
Thank you for confirming the details. I will ensure the team in the Economic Development Department receives the updated figures by the end of day.
Execution. North Korean operatives, working from locations in China, Russia, and other countries that offered permissive operating environments, created elaborate false identities complete with fabricated employment histories, portfolio websites, professional references, and credentials designed to pass the scrutiny of Western hiring managers. They applied for remote work positions, a category of employment that had exploded in availability following the COVID-19 pandemic, at the technology companies, financial firms, cryptocurrency organizations, and defense contractors.
Morning.
Once hired, these operatives would deliver legitimate work, code, analysis, development tasks, to maintain their cover, while simultaneously harvesting credentials, mapping internal systems, and looking for opportunities to extract sensitive information or plant backdoors that could be exploited in future operations. In some cases, the operatives hired local
Leaving the North was
in
difficult.
Western countries to physically receive
I worked in the
company
cyber
laptops
warfare department
and
for the
establish the
government.
appearance of local presence,
I had to
forwarding the
leave.
equipment to their
They
actual
were watching
locations
everyone,
through
and I knew
complex
too much.
logistics chains.
If they catch me, I don't know
A
what they will
North Korean
do.
defector who had participated in the IT worker scheme for more than a decade before escaping to South Korea gave a detailed detailed account of his experience to international journalists in 2025. Using a pseudonym to protect family members who remained in North Korea and who faced potential retaliation for his decision to speak publicly, he described a coordinated, state-run operation in which teams of operatives worked in relay to maintain multiple, simultaneous fake identities across different companies. He estimated that thousands of North Korean workers were operating in this way at any given time, generating an aggregate income estimated by United Nations analysts at between $250 and $600 million annually. What distinguished this account from mere statistics was the human dimension it revealed. He described the psychological strain of maintaining a false identity for years, the constant vigilance required to avoid revealing knowledge or cultural references that would betray his origins, and the loneliness of isolation from his genuine identity, the complex moral universe in which he had learned to navigate. He spoke of the joy of what he described as freedom from a narrow, controlled world, and simultaneously of the devastating personal cost of defection, the near-certain knowledge that his family in North Korea would suffer consequences for his choices. His experience illuminated something crucial about the human infrastructure sustaining North Korea's cyber operations. These were not nameless, faceless operatives executing missions with robotic
The intrusion
efficiency.
started weeks ago. They've
They were
bypassed
human
every
beings
protocol.
trapped
We need to
in
notify the
extraordinary
clients now,
circumstances,
before the market opens.
Are you sure
serving
the
a
data is
regime they could
compromised?
not easily refuse, and living lives of profound psychological complexity. Chapter 11. The Man Who Fought Back. The P4X Operation. In January 2021, cybersecurity researchers received an alarming notification from one of the technology industry's major security teams, warning that a government-backed entity based in North Korea
Perhaps the document
had been
regarding the
conducting a
energy
sustained
sector can be shared
campaign
next
against
week.
Western security
That would be excellent.
researchers.
I look forward to it.
The attack vector was striking in its audacity. The North Korean operatives had created elaborate fake personas as cybersecurity experts, populating these identities with years of apparently legitimate research activity, blog posts, GitHub repositories, and Twitter accounts. They had used these false identities to approach real security researchers with offers of collaboration, building relationships over weeks and months before delivering the critical payload, a malicious file or a link to a compromised website that would infect the researcher's computer. The goal of the campaign was the theft of hacking tools and knowledge about software vulnerabilities. In effect, North Korea's cyber army was trying to steal weapons from the world's most sophisticated private sector security researchers, to harvest the intellectual property of the people who spent their professional lives finding and analyzing exactly the kinds of vulnerabilities that state-sponsored hackers needed to conduct their operations. It was a deeply ironic inversion of the normal dynamics of the security world. The hackers were themselves being hacked. One of the researchers targeted in this campaign was a cybersecurity entrepreneur who went by the online handle P4X. Cautious by professional habit, he received what appeared to be a message from a fellow researcher offering to share a new hacking tool. He opened the file in a virtual machine, a sandboxed computing environment designed to contain potential threats.
It appears to be a highly
and was able to
sophisticated
identify and
polymorphic
prevent
virus.
the infection before
I've never
it
seen
could
anything
compromise
like
his
it.
actual systems. But the experience shook him. He had been personally targeted by a foreign intelligence service. The attempted theft had failed, but the attempt itself was a violation that he took seriously. He reported the incident to the FBI. The Bureau's response was,
Hold one moment,
in his
please.
account,
Yes,
underwhelming.
this is Agent Davis.
A single
The
interview
asset is
to gather
requesting immediate
information,
extraction.
with no meaningful
Confirming
follow-up and
receipt.
no indication that
We can't
any
afford
action
another
would be
leak on this
taken.
case, Agent. The director is
waited.
watching closely.
He watched.
I understand the gravity, sir,
North Korea
but the
continued
informant's
its
safety is
operations
paramount.
against Western targets with apparent impunity. The U.S. government, focused on diplomatic and sanctions-based approaches, showed no sign of escalating its response to match the escalating ambition of the North Korean cyber operations. The frustration built over months. Then, in late January of 2022, working from his home in coastal Florida, P4 P4X decided to act. He had spent the intervening year quietly exploring North Korea's internet infrastructure, a task that he described as relatively straightforward, given the limited scale of the country's public-facing digital presence. He had identified multiple unpatched vulnerabilities in the servers and routers that constituted the backbone of North Korea's internet connections to the outside world. He had developed custom scripts designed to repeatedly crash these systems. In his own account of what followed, the atmosphere was almost absurdly mundane. He was sitting at home, wearing pajama pants, periodically eating corn chips, and watching a film about extraterrestrial invasion. Between meals and movie scenes, he would run scripts on his laptop and a collection of cloud-based servers, sending floods of malicious traffic at North Korean routers and watching them go offline. When they came back up, the scripts would detect the recovery and begin the attack again. The automation was elegant, the effort required was minimal, and the effects were substantial. He was not at a government facility. He had no classified resources. He was a single person in pajamas eating snacks, and he shut down North Korea's entire internet for more than a week. Records from internet monitoring services showed that at multiple points during P4X's operation, virtually every publicly visible website in North Korea was simultaneously down. Government portals, the state airline booking system, propaganda news services, the official portal of the Supreme Leader's government, all of them taken offline by a single researcher working alone in a domestic setting. The outages persisted for more than a week, interrupted by occasional recoveries when North Korean engineers managed to restore some services, only to have them crash again when the scripts detected the recovery. North Korea watchers who monitored the country's limited internet presence noted the outages with puzzlement. Some initially attributed them to North Korea's own missile testing activities, speculating that sanctions or communications blackouts might be connected to the latest round of ballistic missile launches. The actual explanation, a solo operation by a private citizen.
We are following breaking news this hour as North Korea has seemingly launched an unidentified ballistic missile towards the Sea of Japan.
That fell within any of the standard analytical frameworks for understanding international cyber conflict. P4X chose to make his operation public through an exclusive account provided to Wired magazine, complete with screen recordings and other evidence demonstrating that he was personally responsible for the attacks. He provided this account while still using his P4X pseudonym, a calculation made partly to avoid North Korean retaliation and partly in hopes of avoiding criminal prosecution under U.S. computer fraud statutes. His reasoning for going public was clear. He wanted North Korea to know that there were consequences for attacking Western researchers, and he wanted to demonstrate to the U.S. government that a private individual working alone could achieve meaningful results against North Korean cyber infrastructure with a fraction of the resources of a state operation. In choosing to handle P4X, he embedded a deliberate message. The name, pronounced Pax, the Latin word for peace, was an ironic gesture toward the idea that his attacks were intended to deter future North Korean aggression and thereby achieve a kind of peace through credible threat. He was, in his own framing, a vigilante whose actions served a deterrent purpose that official channels had failed to provide. He was explicit about the limits and intent of his operation. He was careful to target systems whose disruption would affect the government rather than ordinary citizens, though given the extremely limited internet access available to most North Koreans, the practical distinction was significant. The sites he took down were primarily propaganda and government-facing systems, used more by international observers of North Korea than by the North Korean population itself. He was not trying to harm the North Korean people, he emphasized. He was trying to deliver a message to the regime. Chapter 12. The mask comes off. Identity revealed. For more than 2 years after his operation became public, the identity behind the P4X pseudonym remained unknown. The anonymous hacker had delivered one of the most remarkable demonstrations of individual initiative in the history of cyber conflict, sparked an international conversation about the appropriate response to state-sponsored cyber attacks, and inspired ongoing debate within the cybersecurity community and the U.S. government about whether the country's approach to offensive cyber operations was too cautious, too slow, and too
The network
bureaucratic
expands
to match the threat it
exponentially,
faced.
a visualization
Then,
of
in
the silent
spring of
cyber
2024,
operations that
the
define
identity
our
behind
age.
P4X was revealed for the first time in a major piece of investigative reporting. The researcher was a 38-year-old Colombian-American cybersecurity entrepreneur who ran a small security research firm and had spent years exploring the edges of the digital domain in ways that put him in the crosshairs of some of the world's most dangerous state-sponsored hacking operations. He had hacker tattoos on both arms, and by all accounts, he had an unusually high tolerance for operating in the gray zones
This
where
clause here on page
cybersecurity,
3 contradicts
law
the previous
enforcement,
agreement.
and international
clarification
geopolitics
before proceeding.
intersected. His decision
Everything
to reveal
after
his
Section 3
identity
has been
came with a
completely blacked out
purpose.
by the agency.
In the 2 years since his North Korea operation, he had been approached by elements of the U.S. government that were interested in his capabilities and his methodology, not to prosecute him for the unauthorized attacks he had conducted, but to explore whether his approach could be systematized and institutionalized as a model for more aggressive American responses to foreign cyber threats. He had spent those 2 years working with a Defense Department contractor
I understand
to
your
advocate
reservations,
for
but
what
the
he
data is
described
clear
as a
on this
special
point.
forces
It's
model
not
of
just the
cyber
data,
warfare.
it's the implementation
Small,
timeline.
nimble teams of highly skilled hackers authorized to conduct targeted, proportional digital operations against foreign adversaries who attacked American infrastructure and institutions. His core argument was simple and forceful. The United States had, for years, possessed enormous offensive cyber capabilities that it used with extraordinary caution.
We analyzed the data streams for weeks before we found the anomaly. It wasn't random. It was targeted, highly sophisticated
and bureaucratic
malware.
structures that made any significant operation take years to plan and execute. Meanwhile, North Korea, Russia, China, and other adversaries were conducting continuous, escalating operations against American targets with essentially no meaningful
The budgetary
response.
allocations for the next fiscal
The
year must be
asymmetry was
finalized
not
by the
just
end of the quarter.
tactical, it
Have the
was
department heads
philosophical.
submitted their
The
projections
U.S.
yet?
treated cyberspace
We understand
as
the
a domain
concern,
in which restraint
but I
was
must
the
urge
default
caution at
posture.
this time.
Its
We are taking
adversaries
every
treated it as a
necessary step
domain in
to
which
mitigate the
aggression
risk.
was the default posture. And restraint, he argued, was being interpreted not as a sign of wisdom, but as a sign of weakness. The Special Forces model he advocated was designed to change this calculus. Rather than relying on massive, bureaucratically complex operations that required extensive oversight and legal authorization, the U.S. should cultivate small teams of elite hackers, analogous to special operations forces in the physical domain.
We cannot afford to delay the implementation any further.
Your projections are simply unrealistic given the current climate.
If I may interject, perhaps we should examine the long-term
demonstrating
impact.
credibly that there were consequences for attacking American institutions without triggering the kind of escalation that would accompany a kinetic military response. We just observe as they hack us. You can have an impact here, and it can be asymmetrical, and it can occur on a much faster timescale. The cybersecurity researcher, after revealing his identity, the response to his advocacy from within the U.S. government was mixed. Some officials were enthusiastic about the model, seeing in it a path toward the more aggressive posture that the escalating threat environment seemed to demand. Others were concerned about the legal and diplomatic complications of authorizing individual hackers to conduct offensive operations, however targeted and proportional, against foreign infrastructure. The risk of miscalculation, of escalation beyond intended parameters, of creating precedents that adversaries could invoke to justify their own attacks. These were real concerns that could not be easily dismissed by appeals to the audacity and effectiveness of a solo operation conducted in pajamas while eating corn chips. but the conversation itself represented a significant shift. The P4X operation had demonstrated, in a way that no policy paper or intelligence briefing could replicate, that the North Korean cyber apparatus was not invulnerable. Its infrastructure was outdated, its public-facing systems were patched infrequently, and its defenses against the kinds of attacks it routinely launched against others were, in the assessment of the researcher who had actually tested them, decidedly mediocre. If a single private citizen, working without classified resources, could take down North Korea's internet for a week, the question of what a properly resourced and authorized government operation might achieve was not merely rhetorical. Chapter 13, The Reckoning, Counting the Cost. By the mid-2020s, the accumulated impact of North Korea's cyber operations had grown to proportions that demanded serious reckoning. The numbers assembled from a combination of public financial disclosures, blockchain analysis, government indictments, and intelligence assessments told a story of extraordinary scale. In 2022 alone, North Korean hackers stole an estimated $1.7 billion in cryptocurrency, representing a significant fraction of all crypto theft globally that year. The total accumulated haul from cryptocurrency operations over a period of 6 years reached approximately $3 billion by conservative estimates, with some analyses suggesting the true figure was higher. The Bangladesh bank heist alone accounted for $81 million. The WannaCry ransomware attack caused over $4 billion
We need to
in
liquidate the major
damage
holdings
globally.
now.
We can't. The volume
Though
isn't
the
there.
financial
We're
benefit
locked
to
in.
North Korea was a fraction of that figure. Dozens of attacks on cryptocurrency exchanges, decentralized finance protocols, and individual high-value targets added hundreds of millions more to the tally. Then, in February 2025, an attack
the scale
that
of the
dwarfed everything that had
$1.5
come
billion
before it.
theft
The
dwarfs the
cryptocurrency
GDP
exchange
of this small
Bybit,
island
based
nation.
in Dubai, had lost $1.5 billion in a single operation attributed to the Lazarus Group by blockchain analysts.
Once
and
inside the mixer,
subsequently
the
confirmed by
cryptocurrency is
multiple
fragmented,
cybersecurity
anonymized, and then
It was the
restructured,
largest
effectively
cryptocurrency
erasing
theft
its
in
history.
executed through a sophisticated compromise of the security infrastructure used by the exchange's senior executives to authorize transactions.
Defend the party center with our
The scale
lives.
of the theft,
Victory
larger than the
to the
annual
revolution.
GDP of some small nations, represented North Korea's most audacious financial crime to date, and demonstrated that the group's capabilities continued to evolve faster than the defenses deployed to counter them. The funds stolen in these operations did not simply disappear into the pockets of individual operatives. They flowed. Land and laundering networks involving cryptocurrency mixers, shell companies, and front organizations
Life there
across
is
multiple
unimaginable for most
jurisdictions
people.
into the
We
operational
lived in
budget of the
constant
North
fear
Korean state.
every single day.
A significant portion funded the country's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. The same programs that represented the most direct and existential threat to regional security in East Asia. The connection between a cryptocurrency investor losing savings in a digital heist and the fuel in a ballistic missile was indirect but real, mediated by the invisible financial infrastructure of a regime that had made cybercrime an instrument of national security policy. The United Nations Security Council's panel of experts, which produced detailed reports on North Korea's sanctions evasion activities, documented this connection with clinical precision. The reports noted
Deep
that
within
North
these
Korea's
concrete
cyber
walls lies
operations
the
had
hidden
become a
infrastructure
critical
funding the
mechanism
regime.
for circumventing
The unlocking of
international
currency
sanctions
represents
regime that was
a new
supposed to
era,
deprive the regime
freeing
of the
value
resources
from
needed to
physical
advance
constraints.
its weapons programs.
Stay alert.
Every dollar
We
stolen
have 2
through
blocks until the
cyber
rendezvous
attacks
point.
was, in
I see him.
effect,
Near
a
the street
dollar
vendor.
freed from the constraints that the international community had worked for years to impose. The cyber criminals of Bureau 121 were not merely thieves. They were, in a very direct sense, the enablers of a nuclear weapons program that held an entire region hostage. Chapter 14, The Infinite Game, Why the War Continues. The most fundamental question raised by the story of North Korea's cyber army, and the remarkable individuals who confronted it is not tactical, but structural. Why does this continue? Why? With the full knowledge of what North Korea's hackers are doing and have done, with indictments filed and sanctions imposed and bilateral diplomatic initiatives attempted, does the operation continue to grow rather than diminish? The answer lies in a configuration of incentives and constraints that is extraordinarily difficult to disrupt. For North Korea, the cyber program represents an asymmetric advantage that is simply too valuable to surrender. The cost of training and deploying the hackers is minimal by any international standard. The potential return is enormous. The political and military risk is essentially zero, because the attacks are conducted in a domain where credible attribution is difficult, kinetic retaliation is disproportionate, and the diplomatic consequences are managed within a framework of broader engagement that North Korea has learned to exploit with considerable sophistication. The regime has also proven adept at insulating its cyber program from external pressure in ways that its conventional military and nuclear programs
Yes, but we need to verify
cannot
the
be.
access logs before we proceed with
Sanctions
arrests.
can target material flows, the steel and aluminum and electronic components needed to build missiles, the fuel needed to power factories. But sanctions cannot effectively target the flow of human talent and digital capability that sustains the cyber program. A North Korean hacker operating from a rented apartment in a Chinese city, using commercially available computing equipment and freely available hacking tools, supplemented by proprietary malware developed within the regime's own institutions, it is extraordinarily difficult to interdict through conventional economic pressure. For Western governments, the challenge of responding proportionately to North Korean cyber operations is compounded by the complexity of the broader diplomatic relationship with the regime. Any aggressive response to cyber operations must be weighed against its implications for diplomatic negotiations on nuclear weapons, for the stability of the Korean Peninsula, for the relationships with regional allies whose own security calculations are affected by every escalation in tensions with Pyongyang. The result has been a persistent gap
Check the
between
inbound
the
connection
scale
on
of
the
the threat
executive network.
and the vigor
It's
of the
escalating
response.
fast. We need
A
authorization
gap
for
that
immediate
North
Abdul
Korea
containment.
has, with considerable sophistication, exploited systematically. The cybersecurity community that monitors and tracks North Korean operations has reached a broad consensus on several points. The capability of the regime's hackers continues to grow. The targets continue to diversify, from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges to defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, energy infrastructure, and the critical systems of democratic governance itself. The tools available to the hackers improve as the operation generates resources that can be reinvested in developing more sophisticated techniques. And the institutional culture of Bureau 121, sustained by the combination of genuine talent, comprehensive training, structural incentives, and the particular moral framework of a society organized around the idea of perpetual siege, shows no sign of diminishing. Against this backdrop, the story of the researcher who took down North Korea's internet while sitting in his pajamas takes on a particular resonance. His operation was unauthorized, legally dubious, and ultimately limited in its practical consequences for a regime whose essential cyber infrastructure extends far beyond the handful of public-facing websites he disrupted. But it demonstrated something important, that the power asymmetry between states and skilled individuals in cyberspace is genuinely different from the
the front
asymmetry
line
that
of
exists
asymmetric
in
digital
conventional military
warfare,
conflict,
a constant,
and
high-stakes
that the
battle
creativity and
waged
determination
entirely
of
in the
individual
digital realm.
actors can sometimes achieve results that the lumbering apparatus of state power cannot easily replicate. For me, this is like the size of a small to medium penetration test. It's pretty interesting how easy it was to actually have some effect in there. The cybersecurity researcher on taking down North Korea's internet epilogue, The Ghost in the Machine. The story of North Korea's cyber army and the extraordinary individuals who built it, operated it, exposed it, and in one remarkable case fought back against it, is ultimately a story about the profound transformation of power in the digital age. The rules of this domain, who can strike, against whom, with what justification, and with what consequences, are still being written in real time by the actions of state agencies, private researchers, criminal organizations, and lone individuals working from laptops in coastal homes. The North Korean defectors who gave testimony about the inner workings of Bureau 121 did so at enormous personal risk, knowing that their accounts would reach the regime and that the consequences for family members remaining in the country could be severe.
I can't show my face because my family is still in the North.
Whether from conviction,
they would be punished.
From guilt, from a desire to warn the world about a threat that was being systematically underestimated, or simply from the human need to have their experiences acknowledged and understood, deserves recognition as an act of political and moral significance. The cybersecurity researchers and investigators who spent years painstakingly reconstructing the technical fingerprints of North Korean malware, tracing financial flows through labyrinthine cryptocurrency networks, and building the evidentiary record that allowed governments to make public attributions and file indictments served a critical public function, even when those attributions and indictments led to no immediate legal consequences. Their work created accountability where there was none, and accountability, even without
the attacks are
enforcement,
escalating
matters.
in Sector 4.
It shapes
We need to isolate the
international
node
norms.
now.
It creates diplomatic pressure. It informs the defenses of future targets. And it tells a story that needs to be told. The researcher who took down North Korea's internet because no one else would, who acted out of frustration with official inaction and a conviction that demonstrating the possibility of consequences was better than demonstrating none, represents something that may, in retrospect, prove to be an important precedent. The emergence of a new kind of actor in international security, neither state nor criminal, operating in the spaces between official policy and private initiative, and demonstrating that the geography of cyber conflict is not neatly bounded by the organizations and authorities that manage conventional warfare. North Korea's cyber army continues to operate. Bureau 121's hackers continue to train, deploy, and strike. The cryptocurrency markets continue to be robbed. The malware continues to be developed and refined. Somewhere in a rented apartment in a northeastern Chinese city, or in a hotel whose staff wear traditional clothing and sing folk songs, a young man or woman educated in mathematics and network architecture and the cultural customs of target nations is working late into the night, executing an operation that will not become public knowledge for months or years, if ever. Their names will probably never be known. Their faces will never appear in the news. They serve a state that denies their existence, the regime that holds their families as collateral for their loyalty. But they are there, and they are working, and the world is
this
only
unprecedented turnout highlights the growing unrest across the nation. Protesters are demanding immediate systemic changes.
The democratic institutions that organize political life in free societies.
This massive grid, stretching across the valley, is the lifeblood of the city below.
And military communications networks that free peoples rely on for their safety and well-being, and for the human beings caught on both sides of a conflict that is invisible to most of the people it affects. The ghost in the machine has a name and a history and a purpose. Understanding that purpose and finding the will and the tools to respond to it with the seriousness it demands is one of the defining security challenges of our time.